I thought we would start with just a brief history of this region, and particularly the region known as Gaza, and that I think by understanding some of the history, we'll be able to better understand the Israeli perspective of what's happening in the region now. So, the residents of Gaza today some of them are what we might call indigenous, have been living in that region for many generations, but many of the residents of Gaza today actually are not. They lived in other places in Israel, and in 1948 they were forced to leave their homes either by force or by choice, but had to relocated to Gaza and are what the UN would call today refugees. From 1948 to 1967, Gaza, and that's this tiny, tiny little strip of land. Right? I just want to make sure we understand that. Israel itself is a tiny country about the size of New Jersey, right? And the place we're talking about is a tiny, tiny strip within that tiny country. Okay? But that area of Gaza was not controlled by Israel from 1948 to 1967. Right? In 1948, the War of Independence, right? The UN had come up with this partition plan. Part was going to be Palestinian, part was going to be Israeli. Palestinians rejected that. Israel was attacked from all sides, and the result was that Gaza and all of Sinai down here was controlled by Egypt. Okay, so Gaza was not under Israeli control at all from 1947 until 1967. In 1967, the Arab countries around Israel lined up to attack it again. Israel launched a surprise attack known as the Six-Day War, right? And as a result, all 5 armies that had attacked begin to retreat, and Egypt is on the retreat out of Gaza and out of the Sinai Peninsula, and Israel lands up in control of both Gaza and the Sinai immediately after 1967. The Sinai they will ultimately give back to Egypt as part of a peace accord with Egypt, but Gaza will then remain under Israeli control after 1967. In the years that follow 1967, with the encouragement of the Israeli government, some Israeli Jews will begin to build agricultural settlements in this strip of land known as Gaza. In order to do that, the presence of Israeli agricultural developments or settlements in Gaza means that the Israeli army needs to be present in Gaza. And just for your own mind, understand at this point, Gaza has no walls around it. Gaza has no fences around it at this point, right? But it is a highly Palestinian area. It is a highly Arab area. Jews were not living there. Right? Now Jews start to live there. And the minute they start to live there, right, the IDF has to be more present in there to make sure that it's safe for them to be living there. Their presence is not appreciated at all, right, by the residents who live there in Gaza. By the time we get to the 1980s, there is resentment growing in these areas and in the West Bank for the Israeli presence, and we have what's known as the First Intifada, which is sort of an uprising amongst Arabs living in Israel. You see pictures of people throwing rocks, right, slingshots, that kind of thing at the IDF. And in Gaza in particular, a lot of that is aimed at the Jewish settlements that had been built there over the past couple of years. By the time we get to the 1990s, the Oslo Accords are a framework for a peace agreement between the Palestinians and Israelis, which is negotiated between Yasser Arafat and Yitzhak Rabin. And in 1993, there was an accord signed. It was not a peace agreement, it was a framework, right, for which a peace agreement would happen over the next couple of years, which would include a full state for Palestinians next to a side-by-side with a state for Israelis. However, that statehood never happened. It never happened, right? So it was supposed to happen within 5 years. It didn't come about, and both sides will blame the other. right, for not having made good on the promises that were outlined in those Oslo Accords. But what happens in Gaza during that time is you see the rise of two, amongst other, fundamentalist Islamic, what are today considered to be terrorist groups, who oppose the Oslo Accords, both sides of the Oslo Accords, right? They do not obviously want Israel to have a permanent state in the Middle East. They don't want a Jewish state in the Middle East. They also oppose any Palestinians who are willing to do business with Jews and create an Israeli state in the Middle East. So they will resort to violent attacks, really aimed at just upending this process, right? And aimed at both the Palestinian Authority and at the Israelis. The minute this begins to happen, right, Israel will respond. Because a lot of it is coming out of this area of Gaza, so now Israel is going to restrict the movement of people in and out of Gaza. Right? They were going to restrict the amount of goods that are coming in and out of Gaza because there have been a number of violent attacks, right, on Israel in order to upend this peace process that clearly came and originated from Gaza. 2000, the Second Intifada breaks out. The Second Intifada is far more violent than the First Intifada was, right? Throwing stones didn't get the Arab population anywhere, and so instead this is headed not by the average Arab on the street, but by these terrorist groups, Hamas, Islamic Jihad, and its most signature kind of move is the suicide bomber, right, who will get on a bus, on a public bus, and blow themselves up, will go into a restaurant and blow themselves up. Far more effective in getting the world's attention. In close proximity to that, the other new weapon, in addition to suicide bombing that begins to emerge from Gaza, is rockets. Right? Islamic Jihad and Hamas begin to stockpile rockets, some of which they're sort of jerry-rigging themselves, some of which they're importing from elsewhere, and they start to fire them right over the borders from Gaza into the mainland of Israel. So as you can imagine, now Israel's responding again. Now Israel's bringing in airstrikes, right, into Gaza, which again is still part of their territory, but it's highly, densely populated by Arabs. But they're striking at their facilities for launching these rockets. The other major thing that they're going to do is they're going to close the Gaza airport, right, which does functionally now close off Gazans from the rest of the world, right, because Israel's not allowing them to come in to use Ben Gurion Airport in Tel Aviv. Right? So it's closing them off, and they feel that they have to do that because they have to control who's coming into Gaza, right? What other terrorists are coming in from other places, and what goods are coming into Gaza, because they're clearly bringing in materials that they're using for bombs and they're using for missiles. The other major thing that they do is they close down the fishing industry in Gaza. They put real restrictions on that because that too was being used to smuggle in goods, particularly from Egypt. Because they would, right? This is Egypt, right? So if you can imagine, even fishermen on their boats, right, are going out just a little bit, and some of them are fishing, and others are picking up, right, contraband from Egypt and bringing it back in that way. Shutting down the airport, shutting down the fishing industry in this area is going to create economic crisis, even beyond, right, what they had already. It will severely impact the life of your average Gaza. Okay, in 2005, Israel makes a monumental decision, right, that rips apart the country in a really serious way. The leadership decides enough trying to protect these settlements in Gaza with our soldiers, enough rockets from Gaza hitting our territories, we're leaving. Okay? And they make a decision, unilateral decision, they're leaving Gaza. They take apart, literally, you should see the pictures, they had to pull Israelis out by force, didn't want to leave, right? Out by force, demolished the agricultural settlements, cities, towns that they had built. They pull them out. They say, we're not protecting you anymore. You cannot be here. We're withdrawing. And it was controversial in Israel, from those who felt like this is our land, we have a right to live on it. And it was controversial from those who may even have been open to withdrawing, but felt like we should at least get something in response. It shouldn't be unilateral, but the decision was it's unilateral. They're not giving us anything, but we simply cannot defend this territory anymore. We're pulling out. So since 2005, right, Gaza is not occupied territory. It's not by anybody's definition. Right? It's not occupied territory. Israel has not had a presence in Gaza since 2005. Right? In 2006, so immediately after the Israelis did what's known as a disengagement, Gazans will go to elections and they will elect Hamas as a parliamentary majority in their parliament. Now, how open were those elections? I don't know, but what's critical is once they were voted Hamas in, and almost immediately afterwards, Hamas violently expels the Palestinian Authority, who had been the party in control, and were the party that had tried to make peace with Israel during the Oslo Accord. So there is no love between Hamas and the Palestinian Authority, and that erupts immediately after these elections. There were literally officers and politicians of the Palestinian Authority who were executed, right, by Hamas immediately afterwards, and the rest of them had to withdraw, and they withdraw to the West Bank. Right? So today, the Palestinian Authority is what controls the Arab areas, the Palestinian areas in the West Bank, but Gaza has been controlled by Hamas ever since. Right? There also, as I mentioned there, have not been elections since 2005. Right? That was by the way, neither of the two places, not in the West Bank nor in Gaza. Okay. So what's followed? Israel pulls out, Hamas gets voted in, Hamas expels the Palestinian Authority. What has followed has been 15 years of a cycle of missile strikes, of rockets being launched over this border from Gaza, right? And these are short range, not very accurate, right? Missiles that will come over the border and hit those areas right around Gaza. So you can see from this graph, you can actually see the cycle quite clearly. Here's what happens. There will be an influx. This is the number of rockets fired from Gaza into Israel. And let's just be clear, at civilian populations. These are not guided missiles. They even if they wanted to control where they were going, they don't have the ability to do that. But there's no sense in thinking that they wanted to. These were being fired at civilian populations because that's what terrorist groups do. Right? So you can see there's a spike, right, in missiles launched. Israel has a retaliatory response. They come back with airstrikes. They come back with sealing that border so that nothing can get in or out, and the numbers drop, right? And it lasts that way for a little while, and then you've got a spike again, right? And then Israel's going to respond, and it's going to drop down again, right? And then they rebuild their arsenal, or they wait a little bit, and again, the rockets start up. Right? That has literally been the cycle of the last 15 years. Okay, that's the history. Now, for those of you who know me at this point, you know that even if I want to present the Israeli perspective on something, I feel very strongly that we have to see two sides of an issue, and you actually can't understand one side unless you first have understood the other. So, give me a few minutes to try my best, and I don't claim to actually be surrounding myself by moderate Palestinians who I talk to on a regular basis who can really fill me in, but this is my sense of what you would hear from a moderate Palestinian perspective on what is happening right now. The argument goes like this. Number one, they would say there have been decades of oppression have built up sort of a pressure cooker in Gaza, and that was bound to explode at some point. Again, no fishing industry, no access to the outside, right? These are people, everybody agrees the poverty in Gaza is immense, right? And anger has been building up for years. It was bound to explode. There's also a feeling that when all other measures fail, then the only resort is to violence, right? And it may not be the first resort, but at this point, what other choice do they have? Negotiations didn't work. The Oslo Accords failed. Any other attempts at peace agreements failed. Now all we have left is violence. This is where it gets a little tough. But I think the argument would be something like this. Even if we could agree that what happened on October 7th crossed a lot of lines, right? Rape, murder, kidnapping of babies and elderly. Even if we agree that that was wrong, what Israel is doing now is even worse. Right? That would be the Palestinian argument. How so? They will say 33,000 people have been killed. More than 13,000 children have been killed. 1.7 million people have been displaced from their homes. 70% of the population can't live in their house anymore. 56%, again, this is an estimate that's out there, of buildings have been destroyed. So even if you agree, right, that this crossed a lot of lines, how can you justify, right, this as a response? And the one that's getting a lot of attention right now is what the UN calls, right, a catastrophic food insecurity, right, that's now affecting 1.1 million people in the Gaza Strip. Why is all this happening? The moderate Palestinian perspective would say, right, the high death toll was due to indiscriminate Israeli bombing. The catastrophic food shortage is because Israelis are refusing to allow in humanitarian aid. And the war is continuing because Israel refuses to have a ceasefire. Right? There have been ceasefire deals and potential, and they've refused them. And this is where, again, things get a little bit more politically oriented, but there are many, right, who do not see this conflict as an isolated conflict, but see it as part of a much larger, right, issue that is pervasive both in the United States and throughout the world, which is, it's part of a larger narrative of white colonialist oppression, right, that has to be opposed not only in Israel itself, but by all groups who face this kind of oppression. Any kind of minority group needs to sort of align, right, and now fight back against what Israel is doing. That's the Palestinian perspective. What is the Israeli perspective? And again, I think we have to own the fact that the Palestinian perspective is a compelling one. Right? If those are your facts, if that's what's coming up in your news feed, it's pretty compelling. Okay. So this is the first thing that I think we need to understand. Right? The overwhelming majority of Jews, of Israelis, do not want to be at war. Right? And I know we have one Israeli here in the room, but so others who have lived in Israel, right? That is, to me, there's no question that that's the case. They do not want to be at war, but here's a really important nuance, okay? And it's going to sound almost like splitting hairs to us from the outside. If you live in Israel, this is not splitting hairs at all, right? And it goes like this. This war is clearly a war between good and evil from the Israeli perspective. What Hamas represents is evil incarnate. People who can kill babies, people who can take the elderly as hostages, people who can rape, right, indiscriminately, who go and they film themselves killing people, or they call home to say, Mom, Dad, I killed 10 Jews. Right? That's just plain evil. Right? And what Israel represents as a democracy, as a place that has freedom of religion, has freedom of speech, that represents good. This is a war of good against evil. But the decision to go to war is a decision between bad and worse. Right? So just because they understand, right, that the fight here is between good and evil does not mean that it's good to go to war. We wish, the Israeli perspective would say, there was another way, right, to vanquish evil other than going to war. And if there was any other option, we would opt for that one. Why? Because we don't value death. And I put here Jewish religion and Jewish culture because it's really important, and the outside world often makes this mistake. Israel is a secular state. Most Israelis are secular. Right? They don't follow Jewish religion. This is not a religious state. There are religious communities there, but the vast majority of Israelis are not religious people. Right? Jewish culture plays a role, but they're not religious. Right? So, but both Jewish religion and Jewish culture place very high value on human life. There's no glorifying, there's no martyrdom, that's just not a part of the way we see the world, right? So and there are obviously other cultures where that is a big part of the way they see the world. It's not true, right? And Since the start of this war, over 600 soldiers have lost their lives. Right? I remember, and I'm sure other people in the room do also, like there was a time earlier on in the war, like my sister lives in Israel, where it was frightening to open your phone in the morning because you would see the list. It was generally boys, right, who had been killed. And you would like hold your breath that I don't know one of them, and then you would feel this like deep sense of guilt of having had that thought, right? That, oh, I feel relieved now because the 7 boys who were killed yesterday, none of them were my neighbor. And at a certain point, one of them will be your neighbor, or they'll be your kid, or they'll be a reservist who's your father or your brother. Israelis don't want that. They don't want to be at war. No question about it. Right? But the way it's seen in Israel today is that it's something you have to do. There isn't another option, right? And we'll explain why. I think this quote, which goes all the way back to Golda Meir, who was a prime minister of Israel, although I don't think people would use the term Arab today. They wouldn't use the term Arab today. It was, in her time, and it was more appropriate. But the sentiment in the first part of this quote, I think, is something which in the Israeli sort of subconscious, it's ever present. And it goes like this, right? When peace comes, we will perhaps in time be able to forgive Arabs, think Hamas, right, for killing our sons. But it will be harder for us to forgive them for having forced us, right? When peace comes, we will perhaps in time be able to forgive the Arabs for killing our sons. But it will be harder for us to forgive them for having forced us to kill their sons. Right? We don't want to be in a position where we're killing other people. No Israeli. Again, there are fringe groups all the way on the radical right, maybe you would say something differently about. But we don't want to be in the position of killing anybody. Nobody in Israel is celebrating the toll of Gazans or Arabs that have been killed, right, since October 7th. It doesn't exist. There is no celebration of death in any way. It's quite the opposite, right? We really don't want to be doing this, but you forced us. You've given us no other option, and therefore we have to do what we're doing. Okay, so if Israel doesn't want to be at war, well, why don't they just call a ceasefire at this point? You've already done a lot of damage, so end it now. To begin with, there were two aims. There were two aims of this war. One was to bring back the hostages, right? And the second was to remove Hamas from power. And neither of the two have been accomplished yet at this point. Yeah. Okay, so why won't Israel just agree to a hostage deal of some sort? Right? So agree, like we'll ceasefire, and you'll give us back our hostages, and we'll go our merry way. So you cannot understand the Israeli perspective when talking about hostages unless you know who this person is, right? And this is just one of those times where I'm going to tell you his story if you don't know his story, and it'll sort of change the way you read the news, okay? This is Gilad Shalit. Gilad Shalit was a young boy, 18 years old, 19 years old, serving in the Israeli army, as all Israeli boys do. He was on patrol inside of Israel when terrorists from Gaza pop out of a tunnel that they had built under the fence, under the border. They pop up in a field, right, and they kidnap him. They take him back into the tunnel and back into Gaza as a hostage. I said before that Israel places great value on human life, right? We don't leave anybody behind. Well, Gilad Shalit was a hostage for 5 years. For 5 years. They held on to him because they knew that they would get their price if they waited long enough. And in fact, they did. And in 2011, Israel exchanged 1,027 Palestinians in jail for Gilad Shalit. Right? A 1,000 to 1 deal, which included many people who were serving life sentences for having killed Jews. That's how much one person was worth to them. Now, why is this important now? Because amongst those 1,000 people was Yahya Sinwar, who went back to Gaza as part of this exchange, becomes the leader of Hamas and the architect of October 7th. So, Israel released in a prisoner exchange, in a hostage exchange, the man responsible for all the death and the hostages, right, in October 7th. So the minute an Israeli thinks about a hostage deal, right, they can't not, right, think about, we've been through this before and we've seen the result. And here's the crazy thing. Israel's still willing to do it. This was a recent report from CNN. Israel agreed, and CNN is not, the most right-wing news outlet out there, right? Israel agreed to a proposal that would release 700 Palestinian prisoners, among them 100 serving life sentences for killing Israelis, for the release of 40 hostages. They're still willing to do this, even though Gilad Shalit is very much on their mind, but there are going to be some limitations as to who they're going to release, right? And the pain of doing so is still extremely high. Micha Goodman, who is a sort of left-of-center thinker in Israel today, put it this way. Israelis are willing to sacrifice Israelis, but they're not willing to sacrifice Israel. Meaning, they're still going to do a hostage deal. They're still willing to release people who have killed Israelis, knowing that some of them might actually commit crimes again in the future. That, as difficult as it is to say, they're willing to live with. But the idea of keeping Hamas in power, Hamas, who in their charter says we are committed to the destruction of Israel, Hamas, who it is true does not have the power themselves to wipe Israel off the map. They don't. But Hamas is backed by Iran. Right? And we just saw Saturday night, right, what Iran can and is willing to do. Right? So leaving Hamas in power, it's not an option. So even if they would agree, right, to a hostage deal, given what they know has happened in the previous hostage deals, the idea that they're willing to leave Hamas in power somehow in Israel so that they can, over the next 10 years, rebuild themselves, right, and try again to wipe Israel off the map is just not something that Israelis are willing to do. This number, some have said 20, some say 18, but this is the reality. The reality is that Hamas had 24 brigades, armed brigades, 18, some say 20 now, have been destroyed. There's another 4 to 6 that are still active, right? And most of them are centered in this southern town of Rafah on the border with Egypt. That's where all the focus right now is. The United States does not want Israel to go into Rafah because Rafah now also has over 1 million refugees from the rest of Gaza who have moved south because of Israeli attacks, are all in this city now. The US doesn't want Israel to go in there because they're afraid of the civilian casualties. Israel's perspective is, if we don't go in, if we don't finish what we started, leave them with 4 battalions, leave them with 1 battalion, leave them with anything, and they will be right back in power in a couple of years, and we're going to be doing this right over again. So we have to finish what we've started. We can't risk Israel. Israelis, maybe, but not Israel. So don't they care, though? Don't they care about the destruction that's happening? Like, how we put those numbers up there, like how do we not look at that? So the answer is yes, but, on a number of different levels. Yes, but Hamas uses their civilians as human shields, right? And that is clear. Right? Hamas, since the October 7th, has been underground. They have hundreds of miles of tunnels underground, and it's their civilians, right, who have been above ground, and they will come up in order to attack Israeli forces, right, or to launch rockets, and then they go back down underground, leaving their civilians, right, up above ground. They hide in the places where they know Israel is least likely to attack: hospitals, mosques, schools, right? UN headquarters, because it makes perfect sense for them. It's a good way of defending themselves. Right? This is an amazing thing to think about. Hamas knows, right, that Israel has been coming in and bombarding, right, with these airstrikes. They have hundreds of miles of protected tunnels underground, and as far as we know, not one civilian has been allowed in. Only Hamas militants are allowed under there. Everybody else, fend for yourself, right, as Israel drops its bombs. Why? Because they know that they can't win the physical war. They can't. Israel is far too powerful militarily. But what is their only chance of winning this over the long term is to turn the world's favor against Israel. Because if enough different countries agree and begin to see Israel as a genocidal country, right, as this pariah state, then they have a chance. If they could create this wedge between Israel and the United States, then they actually stand a chance of accomplishing something. So by leaving their civilian population unguarded, right, on the and actually inviting Israel in to drop their bombs and start killing civilians, they actually win the war. It's their only chance. It's their only chance to win because it changes the view of Israel, right, in the rest of the world. Yes, but Israel already takes far more precautions around killing civilians than any other country in the world. They drop leaflets. Before they attack anywhere, they drop leaflets and say, we're coming in. They let their enemies know we're coming before they come so that people can evacuate. Every bombing raid in Israel has to go through multiple channels, right, of signing off before anybody can do anything. A great example of this was, and this didn't get nearly the press that it should have gotten because it was an amazing thing. Right? In just a few weeks ago, probably the most successful operation in this war from Israel's standpoint, Israel, the Shifa hospital had been kind of a center point for Hamas at the beginning of the war. They abandoned it when Israel came in. But Israel learned that they were going back, that terrorist operatives were going back to use the hospital again. They actually knew that. And we'll know more about the operation, in the years to come, but somehow they almost allowed them to come back into this area. They surrounded it. They knowing that the terrorists were inside, they managed to evacuate 6,000 patients and doctors, all successfully, right, with their medical equipment, outside of this ring and trap, right, about 800 terrorists inside this hospital, 500 of whom they killed, 300 of whom they killed, another 500 of whom they arrested. Right? But anytime you do something like that, you are putting your lives, right, and your soldiers' lives at risk. You know that there are terrorists in there, having to sift through, imagine that, right, having to sift through, this one's a terrorist, this one's not, this one's a real patient, this one's not, this one's a real doctor, this one's not, right? But that's what they do. The numbers, okay, that number of 33,000, right, is just a number that cannot be relied on. That is a number produced by Hamas's Ministry of Health. Right? It's Hamas telling you how many people died. Right? They do not distinguish between civilians and combatants in that number. Right? So who knows, right, how many of those were actually, right, combatants who were fighting against Israel. Children, that children number includes terrorists, people who are 17 years old, 16 years old, 18 years old, who can launch a grenade, right, who can fire a rocket. Right? So children needs its own definition, and certainly their definition wouldn't meet ours. There are about 4,000 people who would have died over this time by natural causes, who are also in that number. This is the total number of people who have died in Gaza since the beginning of October 7th. It also includes anybody who has died due to about the 30% of rockets that never made it outside of Gaza. They fall inside Gaza and they cause quite a bit of damage because Gaza doesn't have an iron dome, right, to protect its civilians from falling rockets. Right? That number is in there as well. Right? Israel estimates that about 13,000 actual militants, combatants have been killed. Right? So drop the civil. Well, nobody's to say that there weren't civilians that were killed. There have been civilians that were killed. But drop that number, certainly by 4,000, right? And then come down a number of thousand more, right, to account for people who weren't actually children, right? And now take out your 13,000 Hamas militants, and that number is significantly lower. It's not nothing, right, but it's significantly lower. Okay. This is from Brown University. It's the cost of war in general. This is the wars that the United States has engaged in since September 11th. You see this number here? That's how many civilians we've killed, somewhere between 408 to 432,000, out of a total of about 905 to 945,000 people. When you go to war, civilians die. That is the unfortunate reality. And in our case, it's been about 50% of those who have died have been civilians, which again, I don't want to make light of ever, right? But you see the numbers a little bit differently, right? If in fact, right, the US has killed 400,000 civilians in these wars, which we believed we had to do, right? And sure, there were people who opposed them, but we had reasons why we had to do it. The cost of war is that civilians die. That half of the population should be civilian, half of those dead should be civilians is not that surprising. And perhaps, to layer on top of that, the fact that you're now fighting, in this case, in Israel's case, you're fighting against an enemy who is intentionally hiding in civilian populations. The fact that there isn't a higher civilian casualty number is actually quite surprising. The line between Hamas and innocent civilians is increasingly hard to draw. The people of Gaza actually, in other words, how do we define a civilian? Who is not guilty in this? They did elect Hamas as their government. Polls, and I don't know how much stock we can put in them, but polls did indicate, at least early on after October 7th, that 80% of Gazans supported what happened on October 7th. And Israeli soldiers now are bringing back more and more material from homes that they've been into that show, cartoons, coloring books, textbooks that just glorify killing of Jews. Now, we can absolutely make the argument that this is just part of the problem, right? That these are innocent civilians who have been educated in a way and been grown up on this propaganda, right? And whether we should hold them responsible for that or not is something we can debate. But if you want to understand the Israeli perspective, every time a soldier comes back with another duffel bag, right, filled with coloring books that show, people with knives in the backs of Jews, it gets harder and harder to feel that empathy and distinguish between civilians and combatants. Okay, what about aid? So they are providing aid. About 22,000 trucks loads of aid have gone through into Gaza. Right? That having been said, Israel does need to check what's going through, right? And yes, they were pretty tight on that security, certainly early on in this process. Much of the problem, again, from the Israeli perspective, is not that Israel isn't letting the aid through, it's that once the aid goes through, where does it go? Right? Your militants pop up from underground, right? They have eyes above ground, right? They see the trucks coming through, they pop up, once these trucks are through Gaza, they will take whatever's on the truck, bring it down to keep their militants alive and supported. So even that which is coming through is not getting to the people, right, who need it the most, which is why you have this sort of catastrophic hunger in Israel now. This is a hard question, right? Did we provide? Did anybody say when we were dropping bombs on Germany or Japan, oh, but you also have to provide humanitarian aid? Okay, that's the perspective of an Israeli. Like, what is the question? Like, where did this notion come from that somebody attacks us and now we're fighting back, and at the same time we have to risk our soldiers' lives to deliver aid to the people on the ground? It's never been true in any other war with any other people ever before. So why is it true now? But don't Israelis care about their reputation? Doesn't Israel care about its reputation on the global stage, which is becoming more and more isolated and more negative? Well, here, Micha Goodman again. He says, Israel has two reputations that it needs to worry about. One is its reputation with the West. Israel wants the West to love them. Wants America to love them, wants Western Europe to love them. It's true. But Israel has another reputation. In the Middle East, you need people to fear you. Love doesn't work in their neighborhood. They need to be feared. And if they have to choose one over the other, Israel's going to choose to be feared in its neighborhood over loved in the West. They'd like to have them both, but if they can only have one, that's the one they're going to opt for, because their existence depends on the second. As we saw on Saturday night, right? The minute others in the region smell weakness, and that's the way that neighborhood works. If they smell weakness, others are going to jump in. If they smell that the United States is not, that Israel is not going into Rafah and continuing its operation because the United States said hold off, right? Then Iran assumes, well, we can jump in, right? And you know what's going to happen? The United States is going to tell Israel not to retaliate, right? Hold off. Right? The minute one smells blood, the rest are going to jump in. The next question that I imagine is on some people's minds is, okay, so we understand, right, some of the Israeli perspective, but why did we go from anti-Israel to anti-Semitism? Are we blurring that? Are we blurring that line? Why do Israelis, and now we're talking about Jews across the world, feel like all those who are anti what Israel is doing in this war are also, to some degree, anti-Semitic? So, first of all, the slogans that are being used. This one, right, which you see most often in these protests, from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free. So, first of all, what does from the river to the sea mean? So I know this map is small, but the river, that's the Jordan River, right? That is the eastern border of Israel. And the sea, that's the Mediterranean Sea, that's the western border of Israel. So when we say from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free, it means Palestine will be free in all of Israel. Okay, why is that a problem? And why is that anti-Semitic? Who wouldn't want Palestinians to be free? Right? Well, the answer is that currently there are Palestinian territories in Israel, right? But the reality is that in those territories, there's no democracy, there's no freedom of speech, there's no freedom of religion. To think that a free Palestine would in any way allow Jews to live there is wishful thinking at best. There is no evidence whatsoever. All the evidence points to the opposite. That if you allow, when Palestine becomes free for Palestinians, it is going to be free of its Jews, because that is true today. If you are a Jew, you cannot go live in Gaza. If you are a Jew, you cannot go live in the Arab areas in the West Bank. They do not allow you to. It is not safe for you, right? You will not make it out. So when we make all of Palestine free for Palestinians, all indications are that there will be no room left for Jews. Not only that, but if you talk about just the actual reality on the ground today, right, who's going to control that free Palestine? Well, it's one of two possibilities, either the Palestinian Authority or Hamas. Those are the only two players in the game right now. The Palestinian Authority is extremely weak, right? And chances of them, and they're not military, they have no military, right? So if you pit the two together, Hamas would win any day. Hamas's charter calls for the elimination of Israel. Very, very clearly, it's what they want. There is no space for Jews in this area called Palestine. So when you say from the river to the sea, and I give them the benefit of the doubt, I think a lot of the people who are carrying these slogans don't understand what it means. Right? Some of them do, but a lot of them don't. But if you want to understand how an Israeli understands that, right, how a Jew understands that, it doesn't mean we should give freedom to Palestinians. Most Israelis want Palestinians to be free. What they don't want is a place where, a reality where Jews can't live in Israel anymore, right? Which is what that slogan means to them.
Gaza! From London to Gaza! To the Intifada! Victory to the Intifada! Victory to
Palestine will be free! Palestine will be free!
That's London, yeah, that's London. And it's everywhere else. It's on every college campus. It's it's in the neighborhood that I grew up in Teaneck, New Jersey, which there are no Palestinians, to the best of my knowledge, living in that area. It's everywhere today, right? This call for intifada means something very specific, right? If you're an Israeli or you're a Jew, right? They'll tell you intifada just means uprising, right? To an Israeli or to a Jew, intifada does not just mean uprising. It conjures up something very, very specific, which is the last time there was an intifada in Israel, this was the reality, right? People going onto buses and blowing themselves up, right, amongst civilians. This is a pizza store right in the center of Jerusalem. Somebody walks in, blows themselves up. So when somebody on Columbia's campus, or in the middle of London, or in New York City, or today in Google headquarters, right, calls for intifada, what we hear is not intifada, it's blow them up, blow them up. That's what we hear. Because that's what intifada was the last time we had an intifada. So it's not about who should rule in Gaza, right? It's not about territory. When you start saying things like from the river to the sea, or intifada, intifada, what we hear is there's no place for Jews in Israel and every Jew deserves to be blown up. Another piece of why this feels anti-Semitic is because of what is perceived as a double standard. So we talked a little bit about these numbers before, but here's the reality. In Syria, 306,887 civilians were killed by the Syrian government. They killed their own civilians. And sure, was there some attention to the Syrian civil war, if you remember it then? Yeah, some. No college campuses were erupting, right? Nobody was lined up outside the dorm rooms of Syrian students, right, with lying out there, staging a die-in with blood on themselves so that a Syrian student would have to climb over, right, these protesters in order to get into their dorm room. It was nothing of the sort. And we're talking about 300,000 civilians. And here, again, we're talking about, it doesn't make it right, but there are some civilian casualties in Israel today. It's true. But it's nothing compared, right, to what's happened elsewhere. So why the focus now that's erupting throughout the world? Right? The US, we killed 43,000 civilians in Afghanistan in a war that just ended. Right? I don't remember any protests, right, for Afghan civilians anywhere. Certainly, so when we see this, we feel like we're being singled out in a way that is just totally different than what is done for any other people anywhere in the world. This is a big one, right? People wanted to know, where's the UN? Where's the UN? The UN has a council, there's a different name for it, it's shortened to UN Women, right? It was clear to Israelis, right, that there had been violence against women, right, perpetrated in really astonishing numbers. And it took 2 months, right, for the UN Women to say anything about it. Now, I have some slides here that are super, super uncomfortable, and they may even trigger some people. I'm giving you some warnings. It's an article from the New York Times. Okay? And again, New York Times, not known as a right-leaning media source, but if you want to understand the Israeli perspective, you got to read this, because it gives you an insight into what Israelis are thinking. Yeah, honestly, I can't read it. It doesn't get worse than this. Right? And again, this is not an Israeli media source. Right? This is the New York Times after weeks and weeks of investigation. And Israelis want to know, like, where's the rest of the world? How else do we explain the fact that these things happen and UN women are silent? Right? And so it feels like we're being singled out for treatment that would not be tolerated by any other people anywhere. And here I'm coming to the end. But there's an argument, right, a pretty compelling one, that says, you want a ceasefire? Well, we can have a ceasefire. Tomorrow, we can have a ceasefire. No question about it. There can be a ceasefire tomorrow. Right? All further civilians, right, can be spared. The humanitarian crisis will be ended in an instant. The only thing that has to happen is Hamas has to surrender. Hamas, an registered terrorist group, right, by the United States, they need to surrender. And then it will all be over. No, everybody agrees. So why is all the pressure on Israel? Right? Why aren't all the protests throughout the world saying, Hamas, lay down your weapons. Stop this already. Gazans are being killed. Your own people are being killed. But it's not. It's all aimed at Israel. As you probably saw on Saturday night, right? 300 projectiles aimed at Israel. Ballistic missiles, cruise missiles, killer drones. And then the president asks Israel, please don't respond. What would happen if it was any other country on earth? What would happen if it was the United States? Can we imagine? It's hard for us even to conceive of a world where 300 missiles, right, were aimed at Miami. But let's say that happened one night, right? And would anybody even consider the thought that we should do nothing in response? Take it as a win. We shot them all down, right, because we have this incredible air defense system, but do nothing to respond. It feels like we're being held to a standard that no other people in the world would possibly be held to. And that feels like we're being singled out. It doesn't feel like this is a political issue. It feels like there's something deeper, right, that's being held against us. All right, last few slides, and I think this is what we'll end with, which is, I think, really fascinating, which is, what is the Arab-Israeli perspective on all this? Remember, there are 2 million Arabs, 20% of Israel's population, and we're not talking about the West Bank or Gaza, inside Israel proper. These are Arabs. What do they think? The one place in the world that doesn't have massive demonstrations right now, where they're not calling for intifada, or from the river to the sea, is inside Israel, in the Israeli Arab population. And that's not because we haven't had unrest in our Arab-Israeli communities. We have. A couple of years ago, actually, things got pretty bad in some of these communities. So they have been known to take to the streets, but they're not doing it right now. In fact, right, the number of Israeli Arabs who feel part of Israel and its problems post-October 7th is almost at an all-time high. Israeli Arabs feel like this is happening to them too. Right? They don't actually point the finger at Israel. How many Israeli Arabs support the volunteer efforts in Israel? Right? All these young men, right, have been gone, all these reservists have been called up, 300,000, right, to fight. The entire country mobilized to volunteer in all sorts of places. What do Israeli Arabs think about helping the volunteer effort, which is helping Israel conduct its war in Gaza? 45% somewhat support it, 41% strongly support the volunteer efforts in Israel. What's happened to your acquaintances with Jews? Israeli Arabs, have things changed for you with the Jewish population since the attack on October 7th? 78%, no change. We continue to interact with Jews, they continue to interact with us just like we did before. 15% say it got worse, 5% say it got better. And who's responsible for the civilians, right, that are dying in Gaza? Understandably, 58% of the Israeli Arab population says they're both responsible. Israel and Hamas. An amazing 16%. 16% say it's Hamas's fault. Israeli Arabs. More Israeli Arabs say it's Hamas's fault than say it's purely Israel's fault. That is an amazing thing, right, coming from the Israeli Arab population. So, all of this was about what we're going to be doing when we come back from break, and we're going to be in Israel Independence Day. And so why? Why are we celebrating Israel? Why do we still continue to celebrate Israel? Because Israel has flaws. It does. It has plenty. And I'm not saying they've done everything perfectly in this war either, right? But it is, number one, the only Jewish majority, right, country in the world. Right? There are 49 Muslim countries in the world. There are 157 Christian majority countries in the world. There's one. Right? The other famous quote from Golda Meir is that Israelis have their secret weapon. Right? Their secret weapon is they've got nowhere else to go. Right? So watch out, the rest of the world, because we got no place else to go. They're the only country in the Middle East that fully protects, right, the rights of women, LGBTQ, Black, and other minority communities. It's an amazing thing. Even things like abortion, right? Far more progressive in Israel than even in much of the United States today, right? It is a liberal democracy, secular liberal democracy, and the only one of its sort in the Middle East. It is the only country in the Middle East that protects the freedom of worship of Jews, Christians, Druze, and Muslims alike. If there's ever going to be a vision of all of these religions existing harmoniously together, right, a Jewish democracy is the only one that's proven it can do it, right, up until this point. Right? And again, as we're now seeing even more clearly, they are the tip of the spear. Right? Iran is the greatest state sponsor of terrorism throughout the world, and it is Israel that is on the front line. Right? And if Israel can stay strong, right, then the rest of the world is to some degree protected. Right? If Israel doesn't, and Israel becomes weak, or Israel ceases to exist, well then it's going to free reign for Iran, right, and to do whatever it is they want to do, both in the Middle East and elsewhere. So I knew I wouldn't finish in one lunch, but that to me is the Israeli perspective.